My name is Sarah. I am 34 years old, and I never thought I would find myself begging on my knees in the middle of a pristine, glass-walled corporate office while the clock ticked down the final hours of my child's life. My son needed a rare surgery in 7 days, a procedure so complex and expensive that it felt like trying to buy the moon with pocket change. When the hospital billing department handed me the estimate after my insurance was abruptly terminated, the floor dropped out from under me. In a state of pure, unadulterated panic, I drove to the one place I thought might show me a shred of humanity, my former employer. But as I stood there, tears streaming down my face, pleading for an advance, a loan, anything to save my boy, my ex-boss pointed to his own sick child sitting in the corner of his lavish suite. He looked me dead in the eye, his voice devoid of any warmth, and delivered a sentence that shattered my soul into a million jagged pieces. A sentence that forced me to cross lines I never knew existed. To understand how I ended up on that cold marble floor, you need to know about the weeks leading up to that nightmare. My son, Leo, a brave boy of 7 years old, was my entire universe. It was just the two of us against the world. I worked as a senior financial analyst for a major logistics firm, a job that demanded long hours but provided the security I desperately needed as a single mother. Leo was always full of boundless energy, running around the park with an enthusiasm that made my heart swell. But then the severe headache started. At first, I thought he was just exhausted from his new school routine. I made sure he slept early and hoped it would pass. But the pain only grew worse, turning my vibrant little boy into a shadow of himself. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening when Leo collapsed on the living room floor. I scooped him up, trembling violently, and drove like a madwoman to the emergency room, my heart pounding in my chest. The fluorescent lights of the hospital hallway buzzed above us as I paced back and forth, waiting for the doctors to tell me what was wrong. When the pediatric neurologist finally walked out of the examination room, his face was grim. He explained that Leo had a rare vascular malformation in his brain, a ticking time bomb that was dangerously close to rupturing. The doctor told me this condition required a highly specialized surgery. The most terrifying part was the timeline. The pressure in Leo's brain was building rapidly, and we had exactly 7 days to perform the operation. If we waited any longer, the damage would be fatal. I felt the room spinning around me. 7 days, 168 hours to save my only child. I told the doctor to schedule it immediately, assuring him that my premium corporate health insurance, which I had sacrificed years of late nights to maintain, would cover whatever was needed. But the universe has a cruel way of pulling the rug out from under you. The very next morning, the hospital's billing administrator called. She informed me that my health insurance claim had been denied. Confused and breathless, I asked how that was possible. She told me my coverage had been retroactively terminated due to a sudden change in my employment status. My heart stopped. I had been abruptly fired from my job 3 days prior to Leo's collapse by my ex-boss, Richard, a man of 52 years old who ran his empire with an iron fist. He had handed me a cardboard box and claimed my position was eliminated due to restructuring. Human Resources had assured me my benefits would remain active until the end of the month, but clearly that was a devastating lie designed to save the company money. Richard had not only taken my livelihood, but also severed the lifeline my son needed to survive in his absolute darkest hour of need. The out-of-pocket cost for the rare surgery was a staggering $250,000. The hospital required a massive deposit up front. I had some savings, but nowhere near that astronomical amount. I was a mother trapped in a burning room with no exits. I called my best friend, Emily, a fierce woman of 35 years old, who rushed to the hospital. When she walked through the door, I completely broke down. I fell into her arms, sobbing uncontrollably, the fear tearing through my throat in jagged gasps. Emily held me tight, rubbing my back as I cried. I told her about the insurance, the cost, the impossible 7-day deadline. Emily looked at me with fierce determination and declared we were not going to give up. We spent 48 hours calling charities, begging banks for loans, and setting up crowdfunding. But the banks denied me because I was unemployed, and the charities had wait lists stretching for months. By the morning of the 3rd day, the crushing weight of reality settled over me. The clock was ticking, Leo was getting weaker, and I was failing him. As I sat in the cafeteria, staring at a cold cup of coffee, a desperate, humiliating thought crept into my mind. There was only one person I knew who had that kind of money sitting in his bank account, someone who could write a check and save my son without even blinking. Richard. The idea of going back to the man who had callously thrown me away made my stomach churn with nausea. But pride is a luxury that a desperate mother simply cannot afford. I would crawl over broken glass if it meant Leo would live. I told Emily my plan. She hated the idea, but knew we had no other choice. She promised to stay by Leo's side while I drove to the corporate headquarters. The drive was a blur of anxiety. I rehearsed my plea 1,000 times, ready to offer anything, ready to beg for his mercy. I walked into the massive glass and steel building, the familiar chill of the air conditioning hitting my skin like ice. The security guard let me up to the executive floor, assuming I was there to clear out paperwork. I pushed open the heavy oak double doors to Richard's private suite. The office was as opulent as ever, with panoramic views of the city skyline. My eyes locked onto Richard, sitting behind his massive mahogany desk, looking mildly annoyed by my sudden intrusion. But then I noticed someone else in the room. Sitting in a custom-built, highly advanced wheelchair near the window was his daughter, Chloe, a quiet girl of 8 years old. Chloe had a chronic autoimmune disorder that required round-the-clock specialized care. Seeing her there actually gave me a sudden surge of hope. Surely, a father who knew the pain of having a sick child would understand my agony. Surely, he would see the reflection of his own fears in me. I stepped forward, my voice trembling but urgent. I poured my heart out to him. I told him about Leo's collapse, the rare brain malformation, the terrifying 7-day deadline, and the staggering cost of the surgery. I explained how the sudden termination of my insurance had left me completely helpless. I literally dropped to my knees on his pristine, expensive rug, clasping my hands together as tears streamed down my face.
I promised to repay every single cent with interest. I offered to sign over my future earnings, to take on the lowest level job in his warehouse, anything he wanted. I just pleaded with him to make a phone call to the insurance company to reinstate my policy temporarily or to loan me the deposit. I laid my dignity at his feet, completely stripped of any pride. I looked up at him, waiting for the flicker of empathy, the nod of understanding from one parent to another, praying for a miracle from a cold man. Richard stared down at me, his face an unreadable mask. He slowly stood up from his leather chair, adjusted his tailored suit jacket, and walked around his desk. He didn't reach out to help me up. He just looked down at me as if I were a piece of trash. Then he slowly raised his hand and pointed across the room to his own daughter, Chloe, who was quietly watching a cartoon on her tablet, oblivious to the heavy tension. He looked back at me, his eyes cold and calculating. The words he spoke next felt like a physical punch to the gut. He said that business was about making smart investments, and pouring hundreds of thousands of dollars into an employee who was no longer useful was simply bad business. He pointed at Chloe again and told me that his money was reserved for his own blood. He looked me dead in the eye and said that my son's life was not a profitable investment and that I should learn to accept the harsh realities. A heavy, suffocating silence filled the room. The sheer malice in his voice, the casual way he dismissed my son's impending death as a bad investment, froze the blood in my veins. The tears on my cheeks went cold. I slowly stood up from the floor, my knees trembling, not from sadness anymore, but from a deep, primal shock. I looked at this man, a man I had dedicated a decade of my life to, a man whose wealth I had helped build through my relentless hard work. He had no soul. He was a hollow shell of greed and arrogance. I looked over at little Chloe, feeling a profound pity for the girl who was being raised by such a monster. I didn't scream. I didn't throw anything. I simply turned around and walked out of his office, my mind entirely blank, the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears like a war drum. I walked back to the elevator, a terrifying calm washing over my entire body as I descended to the parking garage.
When I got back to my car, I gripped the steering wheel and finally let out a scream. It was a raw, agonizing sound that tore from the very bottom of my lungs, a sound of absolute despair mixing with a sudden fiery rage. I had 4 days left to save Leo, and Richard had just slammed the only door I thought was open. As I sat there gasping for air, my analytical mind, the very skill that had made me so valuable to his company, suddenly snapped into focus. A strange clarity washed over me. If I couldn't appeal to his humanity, I would have to find another way. And then a memory sparked in the back of my brain. A memory from 2 weeks before I was fired. A strange discrepancy in the employee health fund ledgers that I had brought to his attention, only to be swiftly told to ignore it. At the time, I thought it was just an accounting glitch that routed benefit funds into a separate, unlisted corporate bank account. But now, piecing together my sudden firing, the retroactive cancellation of my insurance, and Richard's cold demeanor, a horrifying realization began to form. He wasn't restructuring the company. He was embezzling. He was draining the employee health fund to cover his own massive private expenses, leaving his workers entirely vulnerable. I knew the system. I knew the passwords. I knew exactly where the digital bodies were buried. I started the car, my tires screeching on the concrete as I sped out of the garage. I wasn't just a desperate mother anymore. I was a weapon, and I was going to tear his empire to the ground to save my son. I drove straight back to the hospital, running through the corridors until I reached Leo's room. I grabbed Annalise R, pulled her into the hallway, and told her everything. I told her I needed her laptop and a secure internet connection immediately to dig into the company's external servers. It was highly illegal, a breach of every corporate protocol, but I was fighting for my son's life. The laws of a corrupt man meant absolutely nothing to me anymore. Emily handed me her laptop without a second thought, telling me to do whatever it takes. For the next 12 hours, I sat in the corner of the hospital waiting room, my fingers flying across the keyboard. I used a backdoor access point I had set up months ago for remote work, praying that their IT department hadn't scrubbed my credentials completely. They hadn't. My administrative bypass was still active. I dove deep into the financial archives, bypassing firewalls with the desperate focus of a mother fighting a war. I pulled up the ledgers, the transfer logs, the hidden accounts. And there it was, staring back at me in stark black and white. Millions of dollars funneled out of the Employee Emergency Health Reserve and directly into a dummy corporation. Richard had stolen the money that was supposed to protect people like me, people like Leo. He had stolen my son's right to live, all to line his own overflowing pockets. The sheer scale of the fraud was breathtaking. Hundreds of employees were walking around completely uninsured, totally unaware that their premiums were funding his lavish lifestyle. I downloaded everything, every receipt, every digital signature, every damning piece of evidence. I compiled it all into a massive, encrypted file. My hands were shaking, but my mind was sharper than it had ever been. I had the ultimate leverage. I looked at the clock on the wall. We were now down to exactly 3 days before Leo's brain could no longer handle the pressure. The surgical team needed the funds by tomorrow morning to prep the operating room. I didn't have time to go to the police and wait for a lengthy investigation. I needed to force Richard's hand right now. I printed the most incriminating documents at the hospital's business center, stuffing the thick stack of papers into a manila envelope. I kissed Leo's sleeping forehead, whispering a promise that Mommy was going to fix this. I told Emily to stay close to the nurses. Then I drove back to the corporate headquarters. It was late afternoon, the sun casting long, dark shadows over the glass building. This time, I bypassed the front desk entirely, slipping through a side door left unlocked for the cleaning crew. I took the service elevator straight to the executive floor. My heart was pounding, but there was no fear left in me. Fear had been completely burned away, replaced by a cold, unstoppable resolve. I walked down the silent, carpeted hallway toward Richard's office and pushed open the doors without knocking. Richard was alone, packing his leather briefcase. He looked up, his face instantly twisting into a scowl of pure rage. He opened his mouth, likely to yell for security, but I slammed the thick manila envelope onto his desk with a deafening crack. The sound echoed through the large room, silencing him instantly. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I looked at him with a deadly calm and told him to open it. He hesitated, his eyes darting from my face to the envelope. Slowly, he reached out and slid the papers out. I watched as his eye scanned the top page. I watched the color completely drain from his face, turning his skin a sickly ashen gray. The arrogant, powerful CEO vanished in a matter of seconds. replaced by a terrified, cornered animal. He knew exactly what he was looking at. He stammered, trying to formulate a threat, claiming the documents were fabricated. I cut him off. I leaned over the desk, invading his space, and detailed exactly how he had routed the money, naming the dummy corporations and citing the exact dates of the transfers. I told him that multiple copies of these files were scheduled to be sent automatically to the FBI, the IRS, and every major news outlet in the city if I didn't cancel the command. His hands began to shake violently.
The silence in the room was thick and suffocating. He asked me, his voice barely a whisper, what I wanted. He thought I wanted millions to ruin him for revenge, but he fundamentally misunderstood the heart of a mother. I didn't care about his money or his ruin. I gave him my terms, clear and non-negotiable. I demanded that my health insurance be retroactively reinstated within the next hour, with full premium coverage for Leo's surgery authorized in writing. I also demanded a direct wire transfer of the hospital's required deposit to ensure there were zero delays. I told him he had exactly 10 minutes to make the phone calls and execute the transfer, or I would press the button that would send him to federal prison. He tried to negotiate, tried to offer me a smaller amount, tried to play the victim, pointing out how much he needed the money for his own daughter's future. The absolute audacity of him using his child as an excuse for his greed made my blood boil. I slammed my fist on the desk, shattering his attempt at manipulation. I started counting down from 10, my eyes locked onto his, daring him to call my bluff.
By the time I reached 7, he broke. He grabbed his phone with trembling hands and called his private banker. He then called the insurance executive he had bribed to cancel the policies. I stood over him, watching every keystroke, listening to every word, ensuring there were no tricks. I waited as the minutes ticked by, the tension in the room so heavy it felt hard to breathe. Finally, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text from Emily confirming the hospital had received the full authorization and the massive wire transfer. The surgical team was being prepped. We had the green light. A massive, overwhelming wave of relief washed over me, so powerful that my knees almost buckled. We had done it. We had the money. We had the time. Leo was going to get his surgery. I looked down at Richard, who was slumped in his chair, sweating profusely, a defeated, pathetic man. He looked up at me, his eyes filled with a resentful fear, and asked if I was going to delete the files now. I looked at him, feeling a deep sense of disgust. I realized that keeping the secret would make me complicit in his crimes against all the other employees.
I told him that I had secured my son's life, but I was not going to protect his. I turned around and walked toward the door. He screamed my name, a desperate, angry sound, but I didn't look back. I walked out of that building for the last time, stepping into the cool evening air, and hit send on the encrypted email to the FBI. The next 48 hours were a grueling test of endurance. The surgery was scheduled for the morning of the 7th day. I held Leo's hand as they wheeled him into the operating theater, kissing his cheek and promising him that everything would be all right. The door swung shut, and the agonizing wait began. Emily sat with me in the waiting room, holding my hand as the hours dragged on. Every time a nurse walked by, my heart stopped. Every time the phone rang at the reception desk, I held my breath. I prayed to whatever power was listening, offering everything I had left in exchange for my son's life. The hospital smells, the ticking clock, the hushed whispers of other families, it all blended into a surreal, terrifying blur. I paced the floor until my feet ached, unable to sit, unable to eat, unable to do anything but wait for the verdict that would decide if I would ever see my little boy open his bright, beautiful eyes again. Finally, after 9 excruciating hours, the lead surgeon pushed through the double doors. He looked exhausted, his surgical cap pulled low, but as he approached me, a small, tired smile spread across his face. He told me the surgery was a complete success. They had managed to repair the malformation without any complications. Leo was in recovery, and he was going to be completely fine. The dam broke. I collapsed into Emily's arms, sobbing with a joy so profound it felt like my chest was bursting with light. The nightmare was over. The ticking clock had stopped. My little boy had been given a second chance at life, and I had fought a war to secure it. When I finally saw him in the recovery room, pale but breathing steadily, monitors showing strong, healthy vital signs, I knew that every terrifying step I had taken was worth it.
I sat by his bed, holding his warm hand, knowing the darkest chapter of our lives was finally over. As the days turned into weeks, Leo's recovery was nothing short of miraculous. He regained his strength, his laughter returned to fill our home, and the shadow of the illness slowly faded away. Meanwhile, the world outside was dealing with the fallout of my actions. The morning after the surgery, the FBI raided the logistics firm. Richard was arrested in his home, paraded out in handcuffs in front of the local news cameras. The embezzlement scandal made headlines for weeks. The company was placed under federal receivership, and the stolen funds were slowly returned to the employees' health reserves. Richard lost everything: his wealth, his reputation, his freedom. He was sentenced to a lengthy prison term, a fitting end for a man who believed human lives were merely bad investments. It was a stark reminder that greed built on the suffering of others is a fragile house of cards, destined to collapse under the weight of the absolute truth. Our lives changed drastically after that week, but every change was a blessing. I found a new job at a company that actually valued its employees, a place where integrity meant more than just a buzzword on a corporate brochure. Emily remained my absolute rock, celebrating every small milestone in Leo's recovery with us. We spent our weekends at the park again, watching Leo run with that same boundless enthusiasm he had before the illness tried to steal him away. Every time I looked at him, I was reminded of the fragile nature of life and the immense, terrifying power of a mother's love. I had looked into the abyss of losing my entire world, and I had chosen to fight back with everything I had. The trauma of those 7 days will always linger in the back of my mind, a dark memory that serves as a constant reminder to never take a single breath for granted, to cherish every laugh, and to fiercely protect the people who matter most. Looking back on that terrifying week, I realized the lengths a person will go to when the life of someone they love is on the line. I learned that true strength isn't about never feeling fear. It's about feeling the absolute terror of losing everything and choosing to fight back anyway. I went from a desperate, begging mother to a woman who brought down a corporate tyrant, all because he underestimated the fierce, unyielding power of a parent's love. My son is alive today because I refused to accept defeat, because I refused to let a cruel man dictate the value of a human life. We rebuilt our lives, stronger and closer than ever before, cherishing every single mundane moment as a precious gift. I often wonder what you would have done in my shoes. Would you have crossed the lines I crossed, risking your own freedom to save your child from an unjust fate? Until the next story, hold your loved ones close and never surrender your power.